They say success heals everything, but they never talk about the silence it leaves behind. Sarah was once invisible, the kind of woman the world looks past without noticing. And Noah. He was everything she wasn't: powerful, admired, untouchable. Two souls from different worlds, one searching for belonging, the other hiding behind pride. But when destiny crosses pain with compassion, even the coldest heart begins to thaw. This isn't a love story about perfection, it's a story about repair. About the woman society rejected, and the man who thought he didn't need saving. It's about guilt that turns into courage, distance that becomes closeness, and silence that finally learns to speak. Sometimes, the greatest transformation doesn't come from winning, it comes from breaking. And maybe that's why their story matters. Because it reminds us that no matter how far we fall, from faith, from family, from ourselves, there's always a way back. Through humility. Through compassion. Through love that rescues, not consumes. So, if you've ever been judged, forgotten, or locked behind your own pride, this story might just help you feel again too. They said people like me don't belong in places like that, the cafes with warm lights and quiet laughter. I used to believe them. The looks, the silence, the cold distance of those who measured worth by clothes and last names, they all carved a kind of rejection that words couldn't. In the streets of Montreal, I learned early that dignity doesn't always wear perfume, sometimes, it smells like survival. That kind of pain shapes your faith, but it can also lock your heart away. Noah met me when my world was still a battlefield of invisible wars. He had that look, the one that carried both curiosity and pride. The kind of man who never had to question belonging. I was the reminder of everything he didn't want to face: inequality, fear, guilt, the quiet truth that money can't buy peace. Still, beneath his arrogance, there was something fragile. A heart trancado, maybe even waiting for the right knock. It's funny how silence becomes its own language. Sometimes, it screams louder than cruelty. I felt it every time I walked past the glass buildings that reflected a world I wasn't invited into. But life has a strange sense of justice. It plants seeds of compassion in the hearts you least expect. I didn't know it yet, but that seed was already growing in Noah, even as he pretended not to see me. People think prejudice dies with education, but it doesn't, it just gets dressed in better clothes. And there, in that polished world of appearances, I began to see what really separates people, not status, but the fear of seeing their own reflection in someone they once judged. Maybe that's why destiny decided to break both our certainties, his pride, and my silence. It's strange how dignity can survive where comfort doesn't. When I had nothing but faith and a coat too thin for the Canadian winter, I still held my head high. There was power in pretending not to shiver, in showing the world that even broken hearts can stand tall. Every morning, I whispered to myself, "You are more than their pity." Noah once saw me cleaning tables in that downtown cafe, the same one where people used to look through me like fog. His gaze lingered longer than before. Maybe it was guilt, maybe curiosity. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of compassion, or perhaps the first spark of transformation. He didn't know that small gestures, a smile, a coin, a look of care, could carve. There's a kind of quiet courage in showing up to life even when it keeps saying, no. I worked, prayed, and dreamed between coffee stains and frostbite. Every act of kindness I received felt like light after the shadow. People often think dignity fades with poverty, but that's a lie. It only grows stronger when you choose humility over shame. My heart stayed soft, even when my hands turned rough. And maybe that's what caught Noah off guard, that peace that doesn't need luxury to exist. The kind of peace that comes from knowing who you are, not from what you have. He didn't say it, but something in him shifted that day. Perhaps my silence spoke louder than pride ever could, a whisper of faith that would one day become his own awakening. It was one of those gray afternoons in Toronto when the wind carried more judgment than chill. I had just lost another job, fired for not fitting the image. My hands trembled as I gathered my things from the cafe counter, pretending not to care. That's when Noah walked in, a tailored coat, quiet confidence, the kind of man who looked like he owned the air around him. Our worlds collided in a single glance, his eyes, full of pride, mine, full of silent defiance. He ordered an espresso, and I spilled it. Not because of nerves, but because life loves irony. Coffee dripped onto his perfect white shirt, and I expected the usual, anger, disgust, a lecture about incompetence. But instead, he just looked at me, really looked, not as a boss or a stranger, but as someone suddenly aware of another human being's exhaustion. That moment hung between us, uncomfortable, fragile, and strangely sacred. Later, I saw him again, this time outside, when I slipped on the icy sidewalk. He helped me up without a word, his hands steady, his eyes less distant. "You should be careful," he said, but there was warmth behind it, something that cracked through the cold. I remember thinking, maybe kindness feels foreign only to those who've forgotten it. From that day, something invisible began to shift, a thread tying two broken worlds together. Noah never admitted it, but that small encounter haunted him. He couldn't stop thinking about the girl with frostbitten fingers and unbroken dignity. He didn't know my name, yet something in my silence challenged his comfort. It wasn't attraction, not yet. It was curiosity. Maybe even guilt. Or maybe, the first whisper of a heart learning to listen again. Noah lived by one rule: never owe anyone anything. His pride was polished, expensive, and lonely. He built walls of logic around feelings he didn't understand, freesia disguised as discipline. People admired his control, his distance, his so-called perfection. But beneath it all was a man terrified of needing someone. Love, to him, was weakness, dependence, a kind of failure. And yet, every time he remembered my eyes, something inside him cracked, just enough for hope to slip through. I used to think pride was strength too. I refused help, even when my hands were raw from cleaning floors. "I can do it myself," I'd whisper, mistaking exhaustion for dignity. But the truth is, self-sufficiency can become another kind of prison. I wore mine like armor, afraid that accepting kindness meant losing my worth. Funny how both of us, Noah and I, were fighting the same battle, two wounded hearts pretending not to bleed. There were days when we crossed paths again, in small, almost cruel coincidences. A bus stop, a rainstorm, a grocery aisle. Each time, the air felt heavier with unspoken things. His politeness was precise, his smile careful, his silence too rehearsed. But I could see the conflict behind it, the man who wanted to care and the boy who didn't know how. That tension became our language, pride meeting compassion halfway. The world around us kept its rhythm of judgment, prejudice, and appearances. But between those stolen moments, something softer began to grow. Noah was learning humility without even knowing it. And I was learning that asking for help doesn't erase dignity, it restores it. Neither of us said it aloud, but maybe that was how love began, in the quiet rebellion against our own pride. Sarah's family used to believe that love had conditions, that belonging depended on keeping appearances. When she lost her job and her reputation faded, so did their affection. They said she'd brought shame to the family, that she'd made her choices. It's strange how silence can hurt more than shouting. The rejection cut deep, not just the loss of a home, but the loss of being seen. She learned that sometimes the greatest distance isn't measured in miles, but in heartbeats. Noah never knew what it meant to be left behind. His family name opened doors, while hers slammed shut. Yet, when he saw the emptiness in Sarah's eyes, that mix of strength and solitude, he felt something unfamiliar. Guilt, maybe. Or compassion. She had no one left, but she never begged. That quiet dignity shook him. He started questioning everything he'd learned about worth, family, and justice. Maybe love wasn't about blood, but about who stays when everyone else leaves. There were nights when Sarah would sit by the window, watching the snow fall, whispering prayers no one would answer. She carried the weight of rejection like an invisible coat, heavy, but familiar. Her faith was all she had left, and even that sometimes felt fragile. Still, she refused to let bitterness win. Pain can harden or purify a heart, and hers stayed open, bruised, but not broken. That's what made her so different. And somewhere, without understanding why, Noah began to care. Not out of pity, but admiration. Her silence humbled his arrogance, her endurance challenged his comfort. Family had failed her, but somehow, fate was weaving a new one built not on pride or perfection, but on compassion. He didn't know it yet, but her story was about to become his awakening. Sarah didn't rise overnight, she rebuilt herself one sleepless dawn at a time. There were mornings she couldn't feel her hands from the cold, but she still went out, chasing work, chasing purpose. The world had turned its back on her, yet she refused to surrender her faith. Each rejection only deepened her resilience. Her courage wasn't loud, it was quiet and stubborn, the kind that plants seeds of hope even in frozen soil. Noah watched from afar, torn between pride and admiration. He couldn't understand how someone who'd lost everything could still stand with such grace. He'd spent years chasing success to prove his worth, but she carried dignity without possessions. One evening, he saw her helping a stranger in the street, giving away her last scarf. That small act, that small gesture of compassion, made something inside him ache, like witnessing a truth he'd never lived. She worked 3 jobs, saved every coin, and never stopped believing that life's justice eventually finds its way back. Her humility became her crown, and her hope, her silent revolution. People began to notice her again, but not for beauty or status, for her light. It was the kind that doesn't demand attention, it simply draws it. The kind that reminds others that peace and perseverance are never wasted. For the first time, Noah felt envy, not of her success, but of her peace. She'd turned pain into purpose, and solitude into strength. Watching her rise forced him to face his own emptiness. She was living proof that even after rejection and loss, the heart can still find its way to belonging. And in that quiet transformation, destiny. It started with a single video, Sarah sharing her story about rejection, faith, and the courage to rebuild. Her words carried truth, and truth travels fast. Within weeks, Millions had watched the woman who once cleaned tables now speaking about hope and dignity. Brands called, interviews followed, and suddenly, she wasn't invisible anymore. But success comes with its own kind of silence, the one that asks, now that you have everything, who are you really? Noah saw her face on billboards across Toronto. He told himself he was proud, but pride has a way of disguising regret. The same girl who once wiped his table was now teaching the world about compassion and reawakening. Every smile she gave to the camera reminded him of the one he never returned. Guilt pressed against his heart like winter air. He realized too late that his distance had cost him something priceless, the right to truly know her. Fame brought admirers, luxury, and a fragile sense of belonging. But under the glitter, Sarah sometimes felt the same loneliness, only now, it was dressed in elegance. The more she gained, the more she missed the simplicity of small gestures and genuine care. Success repaired her image, but not the scars. She had money, but what she really longed for was connection, the kind that feels like home. Noah tried to reach out once, sending a letter he never mailed. Pride held him back again. The same pride that had built his empire now kept him imprisoned. Sarah's rise was his mirror, showing him everything love could heal, and everything fear could destroy. But life wasn't done writing their story. Because sometimes, destiny lets you lose someone, just to give you a second chance to meet them again. Fame changes how the world sees you, but it also tests how you see yourself. When Sarah's name began to shine brighter than the people who once rejected her, whispers of revenge followed. Now they'll regret it, her friends said. But Sarah didn't crave destruction, only dignity. Still, deep inside, a quiet bitterness stirred. Sometimes, when she passed those who had looked down on her, she felt the old wound pulse again, a reminder that forgiveness is easier to preach than to live. Noah, on the other hand, drowned in regret. Watching her success felt like punishment carved by fate. He'd chosen pride over compassion, logic over love, and now, life was giving him a taste of his own distance. He began to appear at the same charity events she hosted, hoping to be seen, to be forgiven. But Sarah's silence toward him was colder than his past arrogance. Revenge had taken a subtle form, not through cruelty, but through indifference. One night, during a gala for homeless shelters, they finally faced each other. Her voice trembled slightly as she thanked the audience, eyes locking on his for the first time in years. "Pain doesn't make you cruel," she said, "it gives you a choice, to heal or to repeat." Noah felt those words like a knife wrapped in grace. They weren't meant to humiliate him, but to awaken him. For the first time, he understood the justice of life, not revenge, but repair. As the applause filled the room, Sarah walked away with her head high, her peace louder than any anger. Noah stayed frozen, feeling the weight of every missed apology. Revenge, he realized, wasn't her weapon, compassion was. And compassion, when met with guilt, burns deeper than hate. It was the beginning of something neither of them expected, the courage to face the past, not destroy it. It wasn't a grand apology that began to soften the air between them, it was something small. One winter morning, Sarah found a paper bag on the steps of her foundation. Inside, there was a handmade scarf, a simple note that read, "For the woman who taught me to feel again." No name, no signature, but she knew. That small gesture carried years of silence, pride, and guilt. It wasn't about romance yet, it was about redemption. And somehow, that felt purer. Sarah didn't reply. Instead, She donated the scarf to a shelter, not out of rejection, but gratitude. "Let warmth go where it's needed most," she told her assistant. Her actions spoke volumes. It was forgiveness in motion, the quiet kind that heals without announcement. Noah heard about it later, and for the first time, he didn't feel rejected. He felt humbled. That's when he began to understand what true dignity meant, giving without expecting to be seen. Weeks later, he joined her anonymously in one of her street projects, serving food in the freezing cold. When Sarah finally recognized him, he was handing soup to a child, his expensive coat replaced by a simple jacket. Their eyes met, and for a moment, everything else fell away: the past, the distance, the pride. Just two hearts learning to speak the same language again: compassion. Sometimes, the world changes not through revolutions, but through the kindness of two people brave enough to try again. Sarah smiled for the first time in his presence, not because she'd forgotten the pain, but because she saw courage in his humility. And maybe that's how all transformations begin, not with fireworks, but with small gestures that quietly rewrite destinies. Noah had always believed numbers told the truth, that success was a simple equation: effort plus discipline equals reward. But standing beside Sarah, handing out food to people who had nothing, those calculations began to feel hollow. Funny, he thought, how the ones with the least give the most. For the first time, he saw that dignity and worth couldn't be measured in profit margins. Life's real economy was made of compassion, humility, and second chances. Sarah smiled when he tried to discuss business plans for her foundation. "You still think in spreadsheets," she teased gently. "But kindness doesn't follow budgets." He laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was true. Her faith defied logic, her generosity ignored caution. Yet somehow, everything she touched flourished. It wasn't about money, it was about purpose. Noah started to realize that maybe the justice of life doesn't come from balance sheets, but from balanced hearts. He began investing, not in companies, but in people. He'd walk through the streets he used to avoid, listening to stories, offering small opportunities. Each act of care became a new form of wealth. The more he gave, the lighter he felt, as if forgiveness had a currency of its own. And in that quiet generosity, Sarah saw the man he was becoming. The one who no longer needed pride to feel valuable. Their worlds, once divided by status, were now connected by purpose. The logic that had once built Noah's empire was giving way to a new understanding: true abundance isn't what you accumulate, it's what you share. And while Sarah didn't say it aloud, she felt something changing too. Maybe this time, the heart was finally winning the argument over the mind. Just when peace seemed possible, Philip entered the story, Noah's former business partner, sharp as glass and twice as cold. He'd always envied Noah's success and now saw Sarah's foundation as an opportunity. "Charity is just another form of power," he said, his voice dripping with the kind of arrogance that hides decay. He began spreading rumors, twisting numbers, trying to expose Sarah's past to the press. For him, reputation was currency, and he was ready to bankrupt them both. Sarah tried to stay calm, but old wounds reopened. The whispers about her unworthy beginnings, the prejudice she'd fought so hard to silence, returned like ghosts. "People forget fast," Philip told reporters. "Some hearts never really change." Those words cut deeper than she expected. Noah, furious but afraid, wanted to fight back using his old tactics: control, power, influence. But Sarah stopped him. "No," she said quietly. "We'll win this with truth, not pride." Philip underestimated her. He saw vulnerability as weakness, but Sarah's calm was the result of every storm she'd already survived. When she spoke publicly, with humility, courage, and a clean heart, people believed her. Her light exposed his shadow without needing to attack. Noah stood beside her, realizing that love's real strength wasn't in domination, but in quiet conviction. Together, they faced the cold glare of judgment, and stood unbroken. But Philip wasn't done. Envy doesn't die easily, it hides and waits. His next move would test them both in ways they couldn't predict. Because sometimes, the greatest villains aren't those who hurt us, they're the parts of ourselves still tempted by anger, revenge, and fear. And for Noah, that battle was just beginning. Noah had spent most of his life avoiding guilt, hiding behind logic and control. But after Philip's betrayal, he saw clearly how his own silence had once harmed Sarah too. It wasn't just Philip who needed to change, it was him. One night, as the snow fell against the window of her small office, Noah finally spoke the words he'd carried for years. "I'm sorry," he said. "Not for what I did, but for what I didn't do when you needed me." His voice trembled, and so did the air between them. Sarah didn't answer right away. Forgiveness isn't a switch, it's a slow unfolding. She watched him struggle to stay vulnerable, to not hide behind pride again. "Courage," she whispered, "isn't about fixing the past, it's about facing it without fear." That moment became their turning point. Noah wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. He was simply showing up, raw and real, choosing humility over perfection. They began revisiting the ruins, old memories, broken promises, unfinished apologies. Each conversation hurt, but it also healed. Noah learned that repairing isn't about erasing scars, it's about honoring them. Every time he looked into Sarah's eyes, he saw the reflection of who he used to be, and who he could still become. It wasn't redemption through success, but through sincerity. Philip's schemes had crumbled, but the real victory wasn't public, it was personal. Noah was finally free from the need to always be right. Sarah saw it in the way he listened, in how his eyes softened when she spoke. The distance between them began to fade, replaced by something tender, almost sacred, the quiet joy of two people brave enough to begin again. Noah's transformation didn't happen overnight, it crept in like dawn, quiet and undeniable. The man who once measured life in profits and pride now found meaning in small moments, a child's laughter at the shelter, Sarah's smile after long days, the peace that comes from choosing kindness over control. His heart, once locked behind walls of distance and guilt, began to open. He started to understand that real freedom isn't the absence of struggle, it's the courage to love despite it. Sarah noticed the change long before he did. There was light in his eyes again, not the shine of ambition, but of peace. He still stumbled, still wrestled with old habits, but now he faced them with humility. Sometimes, she'd find him lost in thought, quietly praying or helping a stranger without expecting anything back. "You're different," she said once, softly. He smiled, not to impress her, but because he finally believed it too. Life's justice, he realized, had never been about revenge or balance. It was about transformation, the kind that starts inside and spills out through small gestures. Every act of compassion was a repair, every apology a seed. He was learning to forgive himself, and in that forgiveness, found a new kind of strength, one rooted in love, not pride. Sarah's heart softened too. The man she once saw as distant had become a mirror of what healing could look like. Together, they no longer chased perfection, they embraced process. And while the world still judged, still whispered, they had something stronger than approval: peace. The kind that only comes after you face your own shadow and find light on the other side. Love came quietly, without grand confessions or fireworks. It was in the way Noah waited for Sarah after long meetings, holding a cup of coffee just the way she liked it. It was in how she reminded him to breathe when the past tried to pull him back. They didn't fall in love, they grew into it, slowly, like the thawing of a long winter. Love wasn't the reward for their pain, it was the transformation born from it, a love that healed rather than consumed. For Noah, love became redemption. He learned that affection isn't control, and care isn't weakness. The man who once worshipped logic now found wisdom in her faith. Sarah's grace taught him that love doesn't fix people, it frees them. Their connection became a mirror, reflecting both their flaws and their growth. "You don't have to prove anything anymore," she'd whisper. And he'd smile, realizing he finally believed her. Sarah felt it too, that divine exchange between two hearts that once carried rejection and now carried belonging. Love didn't erase their scars, it gave them purpose. It was the quiet courage to try again, to forgive again, to build again. Every touch, every look, carried echoes of second chances. Their love wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and that honesty was its miracle. They started dreaming together, not of wealth or fame, but of impact. Building homes, restoring lives, healing the same wounds they once carried. Love had turned them from survivors into givers. It wasn't just romance, it was a legacy. And though neither said it aloud, both knew, love wasn't what saved them. It was what taught them how to save others. Their love wasn't easy to accept. The same society that once rejected Sarah now questioned her worth again, this time, for daring to love a man like Noah. "She's not one of us," people whispered at parties and online. But Sarah no longer flinched. She'd faced worse: silence, rejection, humiliation, and had come out stronger. With her heart now anchored in faith and purpose, she refused to let their judgment steal her peace. Dignity, she'd learned, isn't granted by others. It's claimed by those who know their value. Noah, too, began to see how deep prejudice ran. The board members he once called friends warned him that love could damage his image. He laughed bitterly at that, the same logic he once lived by. "If love ruins my image," he said, "then maybe my image deserves to be ruined." For the first time, he wasn't protecting his status, he was protecting truth. And that act of rebellion, choosing heart over hierarchy, was his final awakening. Together, they became a living contradiction to the social order that had separated them. Sarah stood beside Noah at events, her eyes calm, her presence undeniable. The same people who once mocked her now applauded her strength. But she didn't crave approval anymore. She only wanted justice, not for herself, but for every voice silenced by arrogance and fear. Her story became a mirror, forcing people to confront their own shadows of prejudice. And slowly, the world began to shift. Not through speeches or protests, but through their example, the power of a love that crossed lines drawn by pride and ignorance. Their union became a symbol, a reminder that compassion can dismantle barriers that laws never could. And though storms would come again, they faced them with one truth carved deep in their souls, that the heart, when open, is stronger than any wall. Philip's downfall didn't come through revenge, it came through truth. His empire of lies began to crumble when the very people he manipulated started to see who he really was. Sarah never sought to destroy him, she simply refused to play his game. Her calm dignity disarmed his arrogance. Noah faced him one last time, not with anger, but with clarity. "You taught me everything I never want to be," he said. And with that, Philip lost the only thing he truly cared about: control. When the investigations began, Noah didn't hide. He turned over every document, every file Philip had used to exploit others. It was an act of courage, but also redemption. The man who once hid behind pride was now standing for justice. Sarah watched, her heart swelling with both fear and faith. "The truth protects itself," she told him. And it did. In the end, Philip's empire fell apart quietly, like glass finally cracking under its own pressure. But the victory wasn't celebrated with triumph, it was met with peace. Noah didn't rejoice, Sarah didn't gloat. They simply breathed. Sometimes, winning doesn't mean conquering, it means refusing to become what tried to break you. Philip vanished from the headlines, his name forgotten as quickly as it had been feared. What remained was the quiet echo of his failure, and the louder lesson it left behind. For Noah and Sarah, it wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about restoration, of trust, of dignity, of balance. The storm had passed, and in its aftermath, something beautiful began to bloom, a love purified by truth, and a purpose no villain could ever destroy. But even peace carries its tests, and the next one would come not from enemies, but from within. After the storm, life slowed down. Fame, power, and battles no longer defined their days, compassion did. Sarah spent her mornings at the foundation, holding the hands of women who'd once stood where she had. She listened more than she spoke, because she knew the silence of rejection too well. Her heart, once hardened by pain, had become a sanctuary for others. Noah often watched her from a distance, wondering how someone so gentle could carry such strength. It humbled him every single day. Noah began to follow her lead, not as a businessman, but as a man reborn. He learned to see people again, to look beyond appearances and hear stories instead of statistics. The same hands that once signed million-dollar deals now carried boxes of donations. It wasn't charity for him anymore, it was belonging. For the first time, he felt what family truly meant, not blood, but shared humanity. And Sarah's compassion was his compass. Their home became a place of refuge, not just for them, but for others. Dinners filled with laughter, children playing in the yard, strangers who became friends. There was no pretense, no pride. Just care, faith, and the quiet joy of giving. Sarah used to say, "Love grows when it's shared." And she was right. Every act of kindness multiplied, healing wounds they didn't even know they still carried. In those moments, they realized something profound: compassion isn't weakness, it's power disguised as softness. It's what rebuilds what pride destroys. Sarah and Noah had found what they'd both been searching for all along: not success, not validation, but peace. Yet even in peace, life was still teaching them, through forgiveness, humility, and the courage to keep loving after the pain. Repentance isn't about words, it's about transformation that speaks for itself. Noah had apologized before, but now, his change was visible in every action. He no longer tried to control outcomes or defend mistakes. Instead, he showed up, consistently, humbly, with a heart willing to listen. He helped rebuild lives without expecting gratitude, often in silence. Sarah saw it, and though she never said much, her eyes softened whenever she looked at him. True repentance, she realized, doesn't demand forgiveness, it earns it through grace. One night, sitting by the fire, Noah confessed, "I used to think saying sorry was enough. But now I see it's not about the apology, it's about what you do after. Sarah smiled, her voice low and steady. That's how faith works too, she said. It's not proven in prayers, but in what we become when no one's watching. Their words lingered in the warmth of the room, a quiet testimony to how love and repentance often walk hand in hand. Noah started mentoring young men from difficult backgrounds, boys who reminded him of who he used to be, proud, afraid, disconnected. He told them stories not of wealth, but of mistakes, of guilt, of learning humility. His past became his greatest lesson, his redemption the bridge for others. Sarah would watch him and think how beautiful it was when a man found peace in serving, not leading. Repentance gave them both freedom. Sarah let go of the last traces of bitterness, and Noah finally forgave himself. They learned that guilt binds, but repentance releases. It's the doorway to belonging again. And though they didn't know it yet, that freedom would soon test the most fragile and powerful thing between them, trust. Trust doesn't return with apologies, it grows, slowly, like spring after a long winter. There were moments when Sarah still hesitated before opening her heart fully again. The memory of rejection doesn't vanish, it whispers. But Noah understood that now. He didn't push, didn't demand reassurance. Instead, he chose constancy, showing up every day, through silence and storms. His presence became her proof, more powerful than any promise. And in that steady rhythm, their hearts began to trust again. Sometimes, rebuilding meant starting from the smallest things. A shared breakfast. A walk in the snow. A conversation where neither tried to be right. These moments, fragile and human, were the true foundation of their love. Sarah began to see that trust isn't about perfection, it's about vulnerability, about believing that even after the worst, goodness can still stay. She found courage in his patience, and he found peace in her faith. Noah still carried guilt, but he'd stopped letting it define him. Instead, he let it guide him, a compass reminding him never to take love for granted again. Sarah saw how much he'd changed, not in words, but in the gentleness of his actions. He listened more, judged less, and loved with a heart unguarded. Their relationship became a quiet dance of repair, two souls learning how to meet again without fear. One evening, as they watched the northern lights flicker over the horizon, Sarah whispered, "I trust you." It wasn't dramatic, it was sacred. Those 3 words carried years of silence, pain, and healing. Noah didn't answer, he just held her hand, knowing that some victories don't need celebration. They just need to be honored. Humility came to Noah not through failure, but through love. He realized that being right was never as important as being kind. There was a peace in letting go of control, in admitting he didn't have all the answers. "I used to chase perfection," he told Sarah one morning, "but now I just want to keep learning how to love better." She smiled, touching his hand. "That's the lesson most people never graduate from," she said. In that softness, he found more wisdom than any book had ever given him. Sarah's humility looked different, it was strength wrapped in gentleness. Even after all she'd achieved, she never let pride take root. When people praised her, she'd redirect the glory to faith, to grace, to the unseen hands that lifted her when the world turned away. She believed that humility wasn't about thinking less of yourself, it was about seeing others more clearly. That belief became the heart of their foundation and their marriage. Together, they learned that growth never ends. Every mistake was a mirror, every challenge a teacher. They often laughed about how life had humbled them both, how the storms that once broke them had become their greatest blessings. God doesn't waste pain, Sarah said once. He just repurposes it. And Noah nodded, realizing that humility wasn't punishment, it was preparation for peace. They found joy in small beginnings again, cooking together, sharing stories with those who'd lost hope, planting gardens where there once were ruins. Humility gave them perspective, and perspective gave them gratitude. And through that gratitude, something even deeper began to take root: forgiveness, not just of each other, but of themselves. Forgiveness came slowly, like sunlight filtering through clouds after years of rain. Sarah had forgiven others long before she realized she still needed to forgive herself. For the moments she doubted, for the times she believed she wasn't enough. Noah saw that battle in her eyes and gently reminded her, "You don't owe your past any more tears." His voice carried the peace of a man who'd learned the same truth: forgiveness doesn't erase what happened, it redeems what remains. For Noah, forgiving himself was harder than being forgiven by her. He carried guilt like a shadow that refused to fade. But one night, as they prayed together, Sarah whispered, "You can stop punishing yourself now. Love already paid the price." Something broke inside him then, not from pain, but release. The walls he'd built around his heart finally crumbled, and for the first time, he felt truly free. That night, silence didn't feel heavy anymore, it felt holy. Their home became a place of healing, for others and for themselves. They welcomed people who'd been rejected, lost, forgotten. Over shared meals and quiet prayers, they watched lives mended by the same grace that had mended theirs. Forgiveness became their mission, their legacy, the living proof that no wound is too deep for love to reach. Even pain, when surrendered, can become purpose. In forgiving, they found the light after the shadow, the peace that comes when the heart is finally clean. The story that began with pride and rejection had become one of faith, belonging, and redemption. Love had not only rescued them, it had transformed them into rescuers. And as they watched the dawn rise over the snowy horizon, they both knew, forgiveness wasn't the end of their story, it was the beginning of a new one. Maybe love isn't about finding the right person, maybe it's about becoming one. Sarah and Noah's story isn't just theirs, it's ours. The story of how distance, pride, and silence can build walls so high we forget what compassion feels like. But when those walls finally fall, we realize, healing doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes, it comes in the form of small gestures, quiet forgiveness, and the courage to try again. So tell me, have you ever loved someone who made you question everything you believed about yourself? Have you ever carried guilt so heavy it changed the way you looked at love? Or maybe, just maybe, you've been the one who walked away, only to realize later what a simple act of care could have repaired. Share your story in the comments. Tell me what forgiveness looked like for you. Tell me what learning to feel again meant in your life. Someone out there might need your truth to find their own. And if this story touched you, subscribe, turn on the notifications, and stay close. Because sometimes, the next story might just be the one your heart's been waiting for.